April 15th, 1931, 15:45, Nova Villa Tamaro, Coney Island. The smell of garlic and expensive cigars was suddenly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of cordite. Joe, the boss Masseria, lay face down on the checkered linoleum floor, his blood seeping into the grout. In his hand he still clutched the ace of diamonds, the dead man's card. Outside, the waves of the Atlantic crashed against the boardwalk, indifferent to the fact that the old world had just died. Click. The sound of a lighter flicking open. Dutch Schultz didn't fire the shots, but he felt the vibration in his teeth. He stood in the shadow of a doorway, watching the hitmen, Lucky Luciano's boys, toss their revolvers and vanish. To the world, this was just a gangland hit. To Dutch, it was a vacancy sign. The throne was empty, and the vultures were already circling. To understand how we got to this blood-soaked floor, we have to look past the bodies, the narrator's voice rasps. We have to look at the man who saw a funeral not as a tragedy, but as a boardroom meeting. Arthur Flegenheimer, known to the streets as Dutch Schultz, wasn't Italian. He wasn't part of the old-world traditions of honor and omertà. He was a Bronx boy who built an empire on illegal beer and numbers rackets. While Masseria and Maranzano were busy playing Caesar, Dutch was playing the long game. He knew that when the giants fall, they leave a lot of room for the rats to grow. Masseria's funeral would be the largest the city had ever seen. Black Cadillacs stretching for blocks, weeping widows in lace, and enough flowers to mask the scent of a slaughterhouse. But Dutch wasn't looking at the casket. He was looking at the men standing around it. He saw the fear in their eyes. They knew the rules had changed. "He's gone, Arthur," his lieutenant, Bo Weinberg, whispered near the open grave. "What's the move?" Dutch adjusted his fedora, the wool heavy with the mist of a New York morning. "The move is a sit-down, not in a basement, not in a back room. I want them in my territory. I want them to smell the Bronx." The gamble was insane. You don't call a sit-down with the 5 families unless you're one of them. But Dutch Schultz didn't care about the lineage. He cared about the leverage. As the last shovelful of dirt hit Masseria's coffin, Dutch turned his back on the cemetery. He didn't see the black sedan following him, or the glint of a sniper's scope from the 3rd-story window of a nearby tenement. April 18th, 1931, 02:10, the Embassy Club, Bronx. The air inside the Embassy Club was thick with the scent of spilled lager and cheap perfume. Dutch sat at a circular table in the back, the dim amber light catching the sharp angles of his face. He wasn't a large man, but he filled the room with a jagged, nervous energy. He was holding a ledger, the math of a kingdom. 3 weeks prior, Dutch had seized 2 more breweries from the Rockaway gang. He didn't use many bullets, he used kerosene. He burned their supply lines and then offered to buy the ashes for pennies. That was the Schultz way. Efficiency over ego. "They won't come," Bo Weinberg said, leaning against the mahogany bar. "Luciano, Genovese, Mangano. They think you're a Dutchman with a loud mouth. They think the Bronx is a playground." Dutch didn't look up. "They'll come because they're starving. Masseria's death cut the head off the snake, and now the body is thrashing. They need a supplier. They need my trucks. And most of all, they need to know I won't kill them while they sleep." The decision was made. Dutch sent out the word, a sit-down at the hub, the heart of the Bronx. It was an insult disguised as an invitation. He was forcing the kings of Manhattan to cross the bridge into his backyard. The streets of the Bronx in 1931 were a labyrinth of elevated trains and brick tenements. It was a place where everyone was looking for a way out, and Dutch was the man with the keys. He had the cops on his payroll and the politicians in his pocket. He wasn't just a gangster, he was an institution. "Fear is a currency," Dutch muttered, lighting a cigarette. "But respect is a debt they haven't paid yet." He sent the invitations via hand-delivered envelopes, no signatures, just a location and a time. He knew the risk. If they felt disrespected, they wouldn't just decline. They would send a hit squad to level the building. At 4 a.m., a brick wrapped in a black cloth was thrown through the front window of the Embassy Club. Attached to it was a single Italian coin, a 5-lira piece from the old country. It was a message. "We are coming, but you might not like what we bring." April 19th, 1931, 14s, a private suite, Hotel Waldorf Astoria. While Dutch was preparing his sit-down, Lucky Luciano was reshaping the world. In a suite overlooking Park Avenue, the young Turks of the mob were plotting. Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello didn't want a war. They wanted a corporation. "Schultz is a loose cannon," Costello said, swirling a glass of scotch. "He's got the Bronx locked down, but he's volatile. Calling a sit-down after Masseria? It's ballsy, or it's a suicide note." Luciano looked out the window. He saw the city as a grid of profits. "We go. Not because we have to, but because I want to see his face when I tell him the new rules. The Bronx isn't a kingdom anymore, Frank. It's a branch office." The context was clear. The Castellamarese War had just ended with Masseria's blood, and the victors were forming the commission. Dutch Schultz was the outlier. He was the wild man of the Bronx, a guy who would kill a man over a bad joke and then go out for linguine. Dutch knew this. He knew that to the Italians he was a temporary necessity. He was the guy who could move beer during the drought, but he also knew that once prohibition ended, and the whispers said it would soon, he would be expendable. He had to make himself indispensable. He had to show them that he wasn't just a bootlegger, he was a tactician. He spent the afternoon surveying the hub, the intersection of 149th Street and 3rd Avenue. He positioned his shooters in the rooftops and the basements. This wasn't a meeting. It was an ambush of the mind. "If they see one weak link," Dutch told his men, "they'll pull the whole chain. Dress sharp, keep your hands visible, don't blink." As Dutch walked back to his car, he noticed a man in a long grey coat standing by a newsstand. The man didn't move, didn't buy a paper. He just stared. When Dutch looked back a second time, the man was gone, leaving only a small, hand-carved wooden wolf on the stack of newspapers. April 20th, 1931, 20 Kwanki, the back room of the Dutchman's warehouse. The night of the sit-down arrived with a cold, biting rain that turned the Bronx streets into shimmering black ribbons. The warehouse smelled of wet wool, hops, and old grease. Dutch had cleared out the crates of illegal beer to make room for a single long table. The lighting was deliberate, harsh bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting long, skeletal shadows. Every sound was magnified. The drip of a leaky pipe, the hum of the city outside, the rhythmic tapping of Dutch's ring against the table. 11 o'clock, Bo Weinberg whispered. "They're late." "They're not late," Dutch replied, his eyes fixed on the heavy iron door. "They're making me wait. It's a power play. They want me to sweat. They want me to think they've changed their minds and are coming with Tommy guns instead of handshakes." 6 months ago, Dutch had survived an assassination attempt by the Cole brothers. He still had the scar on his shoulder. It reminded him that in this business, peace was just a pause between wars. He chose this warehouse because it had no windows. No one could see in, and no one could get out without his permission. Suddenly, the roar of heavy engines drowned out the rain. 1, 2, 3 cars. The sound of doors slamming in unison. It sounded like a firing squad. The iron door creaked open. The first to enter was Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner. He didn't smile. He scanned the room with the eyes of a shark. Then came Costello, then Mangano. Finally, Lucky Luciano stepped into the light. He looked at the grimy walls and the industrial setting with a look of mild amusement. "Nice place you got here, Arthur," Luciano said, his voice smooth as silk. "A bit rustic for a king, isn't it?" Dutch didn't stand up. He gestured to the chairs. "The Bronx doesn't need velvet curtains, Charlie. We deal in reality here. Sit down, we have things to discuss." As Luciano sat, he leaned forward and whispered, "I hope your men on the roof are staying dry, Arthur. It would be a shame if their fingers slipped on the triggers because of the rain." April 20th, 1931, 21:15, inside the warehouse. The tension in the room was a physical weight. On one side of the table sat the future of the American mafia, men who were building a national syndicate. On the other side sat Dutch Schultz, a man who represented the raw territorial power of the street. "Masseria is cold," Dutch began, ignoring Luciano's comment about the snipers. "The old ways are buried with him. You want to organize? Fine. You want a commission? Fine. But the Bronx belongs to me. Every drop of beer, every nickel in the machine, every policy slip. It's mine. Luciano smiled, but his eyes remained cold. The world is getting smaller, Arthur. You can't just own a borough anymore. We need coordination. We need to stop the street wars. They're bad for business. The feds are watching. The feds are on my payroll, Dutch snapped. Not the ones that matter, Costello interjected. Hoover's boys don't take envelopes, they take scalps. A year ago, Dutch had ordered the hit on a rogue cop who tried to squeeze his numbers racket. The fallout had been immense, a citywide crackdown that cost the gangs millions. It was a classic Schultz move. Solve a small problem with a massive explosion. The Italians hated it. They preferred the quiet bribe, the subtle threat. I called this sit-down to tell you how it's going to be, Dutch said, leaning over the table. I provide the logistics for the north. I handle the distribution. In exchange, you stay south of 125th Street. If a single one of your soldiers tries to set up a game in my territory, they won't go to jail. They'll go to the morgue. The room went silent. Anastasia's hand drifted toward his coat pocket. Bo Weinberg shifted his weight, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife tucked into his belt. The error wasn't trying to take the Bronx, the narrator whispers. The error was thinking Dutch hadn't already prepared for their refusal. Dutch pulled a small black remote detonator from under the table. I've got 5 tons of dynamite in the basement of this warehouse, boys. If I don't walk out of here, neither do the future kings of New York. April 20th, 1931, 21:45. The warehouse. Luciano didn't move. He didn't even blink. He looked at the detonator in Dutch's hand and then looked Dutch in the eye. You're a lot of things, Arthur, Luciano said quietly, but you're not a martyr. You love money too much to turn yourself into pink mist. Put the toy away. Dutch held the gaze for 10 agonizing seconds. Then he let out a short, jagged laugh and tossed the detonator onto the table. It was a wooden prop, a fake. Just checking to see if you were still awake, Charlie, Dutch said, though the sweat on his brow told a different story. The air in the room shifted. The bravado had worked, but only barely. Dutch had shown he was willing to go to the edge, and the commission members realized that dealing with Schultz was like playing with a live wire. In the late 1920s, Dutch had been a low-level muscle for the Noe brothers. When Joey Noe was killed by the Italians, Dutch didn't hide. He stepped up, took over, and doubled the business in 6 months. He was a man built by conflict. He didn't know how to exist in a state of peace. Look, Costello said, trying to play the diplomat, we don't want your breweries, Dutch. We want your trucks. We want the route to Canada. We handle the imports. You handle the delivery. We split the points 60-40. 70-30, Dutch countered. My favor, I pay the drivers. I pay the hijackers to stay home. I pay the judges. 65-35, Luciano said. And you give us the numbers racket in Harlem. We want the black business. This was the sticking point. The numbers racket, the policy game, was Dutch's crown jewel. It was pure cash, thousands of dollars a day in nickels and dimes from the poorest neighborhoods. It was the heart of his power. Dutch stood up and walked to the wall where a map of the city was pinned. He took a red marker and drew a circle around Harlem. You want Harlem? You'll have to take it from the Queen. April 20th, 1931, 22:30. Context: the Harlem struggle. The Queen Dutch referred to was Stephanie St. Clair, the Queen of Thugs. She was a powerful black woman who ran the Harlem numbers with an iron fist. Dutch had been trying to muscle her out for months, but she was smarter and tougher than anyone expected. If I give you Harlem, Dutch said, turning back to the table, I'm giving you a war that hasn't been won yet. St. Clair doesn't care about your commission. She doesn't care about the 5 families. She'll put a bullet in your head before she gives up a single shop. We can handle a woman in Harlem, Anastasia sneered. That's what the last 3 guys said, Dutch retorted. They're currently decorating the bottom of the East River. Dutch was using the Italians. He knew he couldn't beat St. Clair without a massive bloody war that would draw the feds. But if he sold the Harlem territory to the commission, he could let them do the dirty work. He would keep his Bronx breweries and his logistics, while the Italians spent their soldiers and their money fighting the Queen of Harlem. It was a masterstroke of betrayal, disguised as a concession. Fine, Luciano said. Harlem is ours. The beer stays yours. 65.35 on the transport. Do we have a deal? Dutch looked at the men around the table. He knew that this deal was just a stay of execution. He knew that as soon as they had what they wanted, they would come for the rest. But for tonight he had survived. He had sat down with the gods of the underworld and walked away with his crown intact. "We have a deal," Dutch said. He signaled to Bo Weinberg, who brought out a bottle of top-shelf rye. Not the rotgut they sold to the public, but the real stuff. As they raised their glasses, the warehouse door burst open. A young boy, no older than 12, ran in, panting and covered in mud. "Mr. Schultz, they've hit the 161st Street Brewery. It's gone. Everything's on fire." April 20th, 1931, 23:15, the 161st Street Brewery. The orange glow of the fire could be seen from miles away. The 161st Street Brewery was Dutch's largest operation, the engine of his wealth. By the time Dutch and the others arrived, the roof had collapsed, sending a plume of sparks into the rainy night sky. The stench of burnt hops and scorched wood was overwhelming. Firefighters were struggling with the hydrants which, suspiciously, had been tampered with. Dutch stood in front of the inferno, his face illuminated by the flames. He didn't yell, he didn't swear, he just watched his money burn. "Who did this?" Luciano asked, standing behind him. "It wasn't St. Clair," Dutch said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "She's a scalpel. This is a sledgehammer." Earlier that year, a splinter group of Irish mobsters from Hell's Kitchen had been trying to move into the Bronx. Dutch had ignored them, thinking they were too small to matter. It was his first mistake. "Ninguém sabia, até ser tarde," the narrator whispers. The error wasn't the deal with the Italians. The error was forgetting that when you're looking at the lions in front of you, you don't see the wolves behind you. The loss was catastrophic. Over $200,000 in equipment and inventory, millions in today's money, was gone. Worse, the legend of Dutch Schultz took a hit. If the king of the Bronx couldn't protect his own backyard, why should anyone fear him? He turned to Luciano. "The sit-down is over. I have work to do." "Do you need help, Arthur?" Luciano asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "I don't need help," Dutch said, stepping toward his car. "I need a body count." Under the seat of his Cadillac, Dutch found a single item left by the saboteurs, a green shamrock pinned to a human ear. April 21st, 1931, 04 Conks, a basement in South Bronx. The retaliation was swift and horrific. Dutch didn't wait for morning. He gathered his Bug and Meyer hitmen and tore through the Irish hideouts. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look for the leaders. He hit everyone. By dawn, 3 Irish bars had been riddled with bullets, and 4 men were found hanging from a bridge. Dutch was back in his element. Chaos. He was no longer the businessman in the suit. He was the wild man again. He found the man responsible, a local enforcer named Vincent Mad Dog Coll. But Coll was gone, having slipped through the net minutes before Dutch arrived. "The theme of this life is simple," the narrator says. "Power isn't something you keep, it's something you defend every single hour. And the cost of defense is always paid in blood." Dutch returned to the Embassy Club, his clothes smelling of smoke and iron. He sat at his desk and looked at the map of the Bronx. He realized that the sit-down with the Italians had changed him. He couldn't go back to being just a local boss. He was now a target for everyone. The Italians wanted his roots, the Irish wanted his blood, and the feds wanted his head. He had won the sit-down, but he was losing the war of attrition. "Bo," Dutch called out, "call the mayor's office. I want a meeting. Tell him if the Irish aren't cleared out of my borough by Friday, I'll start releasing the names of every judge on my payroll to the newspapers." It was a desperate move. You don't threaten the hands that feed you. But Dutch was backed into a corner, and a cornered Dutch Schultz was the most dangerous man in America. As he reached for the phone, it rang. It was Lucky Luciano. "Arthur, I heard about your Irish problem. The commission has decided. We're moving into the Bronx to stabilize the situation. For your own protection, of course." April 25th, 1931, 12:00, the hub, Bronx. The stabilization was a polite word for a takeover. Within days, Italian soldiers were guarding Dutch's remaining breweries. They weren't there to protect him. They were there to monitor his books. Dutch Schultz had called a sit-down to make the mobsters bow down. And for one night, they did. They respected his audacity, his willingness to blow them all to hell, and his strategic sacrifice of Harlem. But the legend of the Dutchman was a double-edged sword. By making himself a legend, he made himself a prize. In the end, Dutch Schultz wouldn't be killed by a rival or a cop. He would be killed by the very commission he helped recognize. 4 years later, in a restaurant in Newark, he would take a bullet in the side while washing his hands in the men's room. His dying words would be a 24-hour fever dream of nonsense and poetry, recorded by a police stenographer. But in the Bronx, they still talk about that night in April. They talk about the man who invited the 5 families to a dirty warehouse and told them to stay out of his borough. The error wasn't trying, the narrator concludes. The error was thinking the game ever ends. In this world, you're either the one holding the cards, or you're the one on the floor. Dutch Schultz was a man of his time. Violent, brilliant, and ultimately doomed by his own ambition. He built a kingdom out of beer and blood, and for a brief moment he made the kings of New York look like common thieves. The Bronx hasn't forgotten. The shadows in the hub still hold the echoes of the Dutchman's laughter. Dutch Schultz risked everything to keep his independence, but in the end, the system he helped create was what destroyed him. Loyalty in the mafia is a ghost. Everyone talks about it, but no one has actually seen it. What do you think? Was Dutch a genius for playing the Italians against the Harlem gangs? Or was he just a dead man walking from the moment he called that sit-down? If you want more deep dives into the shadows of criminal history, hit the like button and subscribe. The streets have a lot more stories to tell.